So this is a talk that I gave about a month ago in Spain. So that was a really interesting thing. When I first put the proposal in, I had great plans of actually going to Spain, to Valencia, um, having a grand old time. And then within days almost of submitting the abstract, COVID started to hit, and I just knew we weren't going to Spain. But they went ahead with the conference. They did it completely by sort of webinar type thing. And so my talk was scheduled for 1:30 in the morning my time, which was great because I normally go to bed at about 9:30. So that was an adjustment to try to give a talk over um, some web sharing thing. So what I really wanted to sort of convey is sort of how we approach assessment. And what I've been doing for a number of years in my first year psychology course is really trying to get students to use assessment as feedback to how much they know. So we used to have quite large exams where the exam is multiple choice, it's worth 50%. And students going into that exam, really needed to understand where they were with their knowledge base. And what my feeling was over, I think I've been doing this almost 40 years now, is that students actually have very poor insight into how much they know. And it's getting worse and worse, as students sit there with a copy of the, PowerPoint notes and probably don't pay attention in the lectures, but sort of just keep track of where we are in the notes. They are having the sort of illusion that they know things when they actually don't. So the point of providing assessments or practice throughout the semester is to really make sure that they get that connection where they don't have poor insight into their own learning. So this project has been going for about 3 years now, where we are trying different things to look at engagement and how we improve engagement and give students feedback. So part of the reason for doing this is that, we're under a lot of pressure to deliver effectively and cheaply to large classes. So we have larger class sizes. I think Psych 1010 has now over 800 students in its first semester. And we basically, I think we're the third largest course on campus now. What we've been seeing over the last 10 years is that levels of student stress and distress are increasing. And that's across all courses at the university, not just psychology. And because the classes are so large, we have less time to give to individual students. So one of the things that we really clearly see is that getting students to engage is really important, and those students who don't engage do much poorer. And so we need to make sure that we're giving students feedback throughout the whole process. And so one of the other things that, I've been looking at and trying to get my head around is this idea that assessment isn't really summative, that assessment is all about learning. It's part of the learning. And I remember as a student that assessments were really the thing that drove my learning. And so this isn't a new idea, that assessment is actually an effective learning tool. So here's a study back from 1939, where this guy Spicer was looking at memory retention. And so he did a really complicated study with lots of different groups, where he actually did a classic psychology memory test where they learn something on day one and then they're tested on either that content on day one or later to see what retention is. And so this is really, really phenomenal information for us as teachers, that here's just a few of the groups that show the data or the effect of retention. And so what I really want to draw your attention to is that all students are learning the information here. And then some of the students are tested very early on, and this is the number of days since learning the content. If they're tested very early on, and then also later on, their retention is much higher here than students who have a delay between when they learn the material and the first test on that material. All right, so they lose approximately 60 somewhere between 75 and 60% of the content they lose before even having their first test, if they have not been tested on it between that time. So having a test fairly early on does something in the brain to the systems of memory that make it much more resilient to forgetting. All right, so that's not the only place that this has been studied. There's lots of work that's been studied on how the kind of ways of studying and the ways of retaining information are good. So here's another study, a more recent one, where they looked at studying versus studying and also having a test. All right, so the important thing here is that if you do this on the first day, so the short-term memory or fairly short memory stuff, there doesn't seem to be any difference between studying and studying in a test. But if you wait 2 days, then you start to see a difference. And if you wait 7 days, and as this time goes on, the benefits of actually having a test early on has an impact on later testing. So testing isn't just a summative thing, it's also a formative thing. So here's the design of our experiment. It is also quite a complex experiment. So we have a number of modules in Psych 1010. They're all divided into 3-week sort of sections. At the end of those 3-week sections, they have a quiz. So every module has a quiz. And before each quiz, I give students practice tests. Now, the important thing is that the questions on the quiz aren't the same as the practice, but they cover the same content. I have hundreds of questions that I've created for both the quiz and the practice, and I basically create a long list of them by alphabetical order, and then just sort of randomly assign some to the quiz and some to the practice. So students have opportunity to practice, and somewhere between about 30 and 60% of students, depending on what year it is and so on, engage in this practice. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is to get more students to engage in practice, to get particularly the students who aren't engaging very much to the practice. So the study itself has a reward or an incentive for them to do the practice, and that is for Module 2 and Module 4. If they've done at least 2 of the 3 practice tests, and then they do the quiz, they get another chance to do more practice and another attempt at the quiz, and I'll take their best mark. That generally works really well to get students to do the practice tests. And so what I also want them to do is not just do the practice tests, but of course use the practice tests as feedback so that they can target their studying. And generally, I think that works. I certainly see improvements in the quiz scores. And again, the questions in the second version of the quiz are not the same as the first version. They're, again, different questions. All right, so in the 2019 version of this project, we had a baseline, an intervention, a baseline, an intervention. So that's a very classic psychology type study where we're looking at the effects of this intervention. So the other thing that's quite interesting in this is that for this practice in the intervention modules, I actually weight the content of the practices a little bit funny. So I've got 2 groups of students. Some of them get a higher number of practice test questions from one of the module content areas, and the other group get more practice test questions from a different set of module content. And that way I can actually see if the effects that I see because of this intervention are due to just an overall engagement effect, or specifically practicing on content, or if there are content specific effects. And we do that twice. So we also measure a whole bunch of psychological variables. So we've got demographics, we've got measures of resilience, we've got a measure of depression, anxiety, and stress, we've got a measure of motivation. And before each quiz, before they actually see the quiz, they actually have to do this "Are you ready for the quiz?" little survey that just asks how they've been studying, how they've been using practice tests, and so on. So we've got lots and lots of data. My honors students basically spend 2 or 3 months analyzing this data every year. before we, figure out what's going on in each course. So here's some data. So on the left here, we see this is the percentage of students who did practice before quiz one. And remember, for quiz one, I just encouraged them. I said, look, it's really good to do practice. You should do practice. So these are the students who did at least one practice test. And this was actually up from 2018. In 2018, about 35% did practice during this first module. Here's where we have the intervention in place. And we said, if you do at least two practice, then you get a second go at the quiz. And now it's up over 90%. So lots and lots of students are now doing at least some practice. All right, we take the intervention away and it goes down, and we put the intervention back on and it goes back up. So the intervention itself is clearly a motivating factor for doing the practice tests. If we look at their performance on the quizzes, all right, now this is just the first attempt at each of the quizzes because we need to be able to compare it to the baselines. Their performance on the quiz is clearly improved during the interventions. So the practice testing seems to either improve their knowledge of the content or improve their engagement with the content so that they're actually doing better. If we look at how students are doing based on how many practice tests they've done, we have that data for each of the modules, and we can see that students who've done no practice tests, and so that's this bar here, are scoring significantly less than students who've done some, and the students who are doing all three practice tests are clearly doing much, much better overall. There's a 10-point difference in the performance on this quiz, and that difference actually gets bigger across the semester. So the students who are continually doing no practice tests are actually doing worse over the semester, and students who are picking up and doing the practice tests are getting better over the semester. This test was a little bit difficult, and all students seem to do a little bit worse on that test. But again, that effect is still clearly visible there. Now, we also measured their stress and anxiety. We did that twice over this semester, and we found no difference across the semester. So it seems like there are just some students who are stressed. How did they do on these tests? And what we can see here is that compared to students who've got low distress, students who've got severe distress, and this is severe according to the norms for the depression, anxiety, and stress scale. So they are scoring quite high on this scale, not high enough to be sort of, referred for, sort of a clinical intervention, but high on the scale. They generally do worse. But if those students who got high stress are engaging in practice tests, they're actually not different from students who are not stressed. Whereas the students who are high stressed and have low engagement are actually significantly worse than those who have no stress and are low engagement. So we think that the students who are have a problem with stress and anxiety, that the practice tests actually help them get over some of the stress that's associated with those assessments or the tests and so on, so they can perform just as well. All right, the last thing I want to tell you about is really how this affects their performance on the exam, right? Which is, sometimes months later. And we can see that now we've accumulated all the practice tests that they've been able to do over the semester, and because they can do, 3 for module 1 and 3 for module 2 and 3 for module 3 and 3 for module 4. There's I think up to 16 practice tests they can do, including an overall practice for the exam. And so the more that students have done practice tests, the higher they score on that exam. Now, to some extent, that is students who are good students are likely to do practice tests, but the data that we've looked at shows that if you can get students to engage, their performance stays higher across the semester. So if they were initially not doing practice tests and you get them to do practice tests, their performance improves. And that's it. So for conclusion, practice tests help students. And so what we really see is that it doesn't matter what you do, that behavior predicts behavior, that if you can get students to actually engage in practice tests, it doesn't matter why they do it. If they do it, they'll do better. And they actually learn more content and they actually retain more content. It's important to give feedback. So we asked students if they looked at the feedback from the practice tests, and the students who said no, they actually did not improve across the semester. Only the students who did the practice and looked at the feedback were actually improving across the semester. And we think that this is really important for helping students who have high levels of stress to do well at university. And that's something that I think we should all be thinking about, given how much stress students are under, especially under COVID. And so we have these long-term effects. Now, just to wrap up and talk about 2020, oh my God, it was so difficult to get students to do things on time. It was just, deadlines just became meaningless to students. And so I've had to extend deadlines. I've had to hassle students to complete work. They just don't seem to understand what a deadline is anymore. So I'll wrap it up there.